All right, hello Facebook. This is Tommy Valentine, Executive Director at Historic Athens. I hope that you're doing well today. We're so glad that you've tuned in for today's episode. This is episode 48 out of a planned 55 episodes in our series, This Moment in History, COVID-19 in Athens, Georgia. If you're tuned in via a watch party, hello, and thank you to whoever shared this post. If you've tuned in as an archive video, we hope that you watch this along with our other archive videos in the videos section of our Facebook page. But if you're watching live, we want you to know that this is something not just to watch, it's also something you can participate in. If you're watching this at the main Historic Athens Facebook page, you can comment below this video, and as long as we're live, you can actually have that comment shared on screen and we can address it live as we go. So if you have a question, a word of encouragement, something that you feel we'd benefit by doing a deeper dive, definitely throw it out there. That's for two reasons. One is it makes for a more engaging program for you and everyone else. But also, this is a historic document. This, along with the other 54 episodes that comprise this series, will be compiled into a digital archive and provided to our local libraries and research institutions so that future generations can get a sense of what this moment was like in Athens history. By contributing your question, sharing your perspective, that helps inform that historic document and make for a better record of this time in Athens, Georgia history. Each week of the 11-week series that we're doing here is brought to you by a different local sponsor. We want to thank this week's sponsor, which is the Athens Downtown Development Authority, the ADDA. We want to thank David Lynn, Linda Ford, everyone over there for making it possible for us to document and explore this unique, often difficult, but historically distinct moment in Athens history. With all that said, about halfway through the program today, we'll tell you more about Historic Athens and how you can get plugged in. But for now, let's go ahead and bring on our guest. So today's guest is someone that you'll be very excited to hear from. Dr. Kim Klonowski works at the University of Georgia. She's an immunologist. And so certainly the times we're in, there are a few people that would be more interesting for us to talk to. She also is someone that I had the pleasure of meeting through her role as last year's president for Historic Athens and her current role as a trustee at Historic Athens. So she's someone that knows historic preservation, history, and immunology. So someone that we're very excited to talk to. So I'm going to make some switches here so we can go ahead and get her on board, and then we'll begin today's conversation. Thanks again for tuning in. All right, and all right, Kim, thank you so much for joining us today. Let me just switch on audio and make sure everything's set up properly. All right, great. Thank you so much for joining us, Kim. How are you today?
I'm great. Thanks for having me, Tommy. This is a really exciting opportunity, not just to be a part of this series, which I think is so incredibly wonderful, but also the opportunity to talk science with the general community, which I unfortunately don't do as much as I want to do. So I'm really excited to do that today.
You know, Kim, for many of the folks I know that are scientists, I don't know if the stereotype of the introverted scientist is real, but I do know that the practice of science seems to be very introverted practice. But this year, more than ever, we've been counting on our scientists to be extroverted communicators and to tell us what's going on. I imagine that's been an interesting change to suddenly have everyone in America looking towards you.
It's an interesting time, and it's also interesting because we also have the internet. We have a lot of people who are checking into the internet from various sources, and that kind of sometimes muddles the water. Mm-hmm. You know, we as scientists do have a duty to connect to the public. And again, I personally don't think that we do it enough. So I really appreciate this opportunity today to do that.
Kim, there are so many questions I'm going to want to ask you about COVID-19 and about this unique historic moment. And it's going to be hard to squeeze this all into an hour. But I think it's really important that we start by getting to know you, getting to know what an immunologist is, what they do, and also your relationship to the Athens community. I think that's relevant. So can you give us a little bit of your background and introduce yourself for a moment?
Sure. I received my PhD in immunology from Temple University in Philadelphia. And there I went on. So typically when you get your PhD, it's usually in a topic. So mine was in microbiology and immunology. which doesn't mean that's what you're stuck to. So there are some perfectly great immunologists, I mean, actually brilliant immunologists who maybe even trained in other disciplines like biochemistry, for example. But really, to kind of take it even back further is when you get your PhD, it's not necessarily about the field that you're working in. It's more to kind of become a scientist. So you spend those 5 years understanding what it means to do experiments, to think about your own experiments, to design your own experiments. And then after that, you go on and you do what's referred to as a postdoctoral fellowship. So I did mine at the University of Connecticut, and you spend about 5 years. So people who maybe are more familiar with medicine, it's kind of the equivalency of doing a residency. It's where you kind of dig a little deeper into the field. You're more on your own, although you have some guidance from the person who is kind of running the lab. So I started out not working on viruses. So my PhD was not with viruses. When I went and did my postdoc, I became very interested in viruses. And I've kind of transitioned that. So when I got hired at the University of Georgia, that's when I kind of continued that research. And UGA has a very strong research program in influenza viruses. So I had kind of taken some of my basic immunology that I had from my training and kind of transitioned it to some of the strengths that UGA had. So it was a really great fit at the time. And it has continued to be. So UGA, again, has a very strong immunology program and a very strong program in terms of influenza research. There's a lot of that happening at UGA.
For the majority of our conversation today, I know we'll be focused on your immunology background. You're also someone that has a great love of history, and that's certainly relevant to us. Can you talk about your relationship and passion for history?
I love history. So I'm going to bring this up now because I want to make sure that I do it before we end. So this is one of my favorite books. You can get it at Avid Bookshop. It's called Flu, the Story of the Great Influenza Pandemic of 1918 and the Search for the Virus That Caused It. So I actually taught an Odyssey class 2 years ago because it was the 100th anniversary of the Great Influenza. So we spent a lot of time with, so the new students who come in, for people who aren't aware of the Odyssey program, UGA students come in, and they come in very small settings. So it's usually 15 students or less who come into a class. And we get to know each other. It's more of an interaction. That's the whole point of the class, is to talk about different topics. And I decided that talking about pandemics and talking about influenza, who could have predicted this, was a great opportunity at the time. And so we talked about this book. We talked about history because I love history. And this was more of a blend of history and science, which I really appreciated. And I want to tell people, if they're interested in reading about this is not something that just scientists can read. It's actually a lot about history. It's also a great adventure story. So it's a great book to read, and I'm actually rereading it again now. I've tried to actually, I'm an avid reader, and I've tried to kind of stay away from some of the nonfiction just to kind of reset myself personally. But this one I'm rereading right now because I think it's just so appropriate for the time.
Great. Thank you, Kim. I went ahead and shared the link to the Avid purchase link for this book that Kim just brought up. And so if you'd like to get a copy for yourself, Kim, I actually think my mom is reading this book right now. I know that as soon as you held up the title, I recognized the cover, but yeah.
It's a fun story. I mean, it's an adventure because, at the time, we're talking about, 100 years ago, they didn't even know what a virus was at that time. So trying to figure out, what was happening, what was the organism that was causing the disease that they were witnessing, it's just amazing. And then on top of that, it's an adventure story because, the virus went away. So we didn't know where it was. So it goes through kind of the adventure kind of part of the book where they are trying to find samples that they can kind of bring back and then recreate the virus and then really study it. So it's a really fun story, and I really highly recommend it. And my students loved it. They had no idea. One of the things that we talked about, which I think is important for today's discussion, is that I asked them specifically if they had ever heard of the Great Influenza, if they had ever heard about the 1918 influenza. And I would say 95% of them said no. I asked about what they learned in class, what they learned in history. And most of them said, I went back after reading this and talking about this in class, and I went back to my history books that I had that I still, were holding on to for whatever reason. And they said it was one sentence.
Right.
One sentence that devastated millions of people. I mean, it's amazing how much in terms of history that we've forgotten, which is
Yeah.
it's really interesting when we're thinking about this time.
So I'm a big nerd. And so when I've been running a lot during the pandemic, and I know some people out there, they just listen to the sound of the wind blow, or they listen to really great music. I tend to listen to a lot of podcasts, and spring break, the week where shelter in place broke out, and or where a lot of our awareness of this disease broke out, I found myself out running, listening to the history of the 1918 flu. And it is so incredibly strange to listen to, because it feels bizarre that we didn't go over this in history class. I mean, we're talking about something that I believe killed 40 million people.
A lot of people.
And so, in listening to the history about it and trying to understand that, we call it the Spanish flu. Oh, thanks. Alex Sams just jumped in to say Tommy's right. He is a big nerd. Thanks, Alex. That's high praise coming from you. I appreciate that. No, I mean, reading about the idea that we call it the Spanish flu based on Spain's transparency about their own struggles with the disease at a time where we were at war, so different countries were covering up their numbers. I couldn't help but leave that podcast with the following thought that I just want to share with you, Kim, and see what you think about when we talk about history and disease. We aren't scared when we teach history to talk about the great men of history or the great wars or the great battles. We aren't scared to talk about who invented this or who signed that. But it does seem like there's something in us that feels, I had a prior guest talk about it in terms of disgust, that we're almost terrified to talk about disease. Maybe we'll talk about, the bubonic plague because it's so long ago. But when we talk about something that recent, suddenly everything else takes on a different shape. You go, oh, wait, Howard Hughes was scared of disease, but he was alive during the 1918 flu. Did that shape it? I mean, the history takes on a different shape. Why do you think it is that we aren't talking about disease in our history classes?
It's a great question. I mean, we do have some classes at UGA, I will say, that do cover some of these topics. So there's a great class that students can take called People, Plagues, and Parasites. It's a great class that is offered at UGA. But I think part of it is we think about diseases as being dirty. We think about them as being a lower class kind of issue. And I don't know if we just feel like we're beyond that in some ways, that it becomes this part of history that we kind of shove aside. But the interesting thing about the 1918 flu, which I really am surprised that we don't talk about more in terms of history,
right?
You kind of mentioned it, was the impact that it had on our armed forces. So that, a lot of what we learned about this virus, even, after the fact, was because of the fact that we had these kind of controlled studies. So we had people at army bases, right? So that we could track and watch spread of disease. When they isolated eventually some of the 1918 strains of influenza, it was because the army had pathology samples that they had stored. So the military has always been kind of front and center in terms of helping science progress. But when we talk about military history, we don't talk about it very much. And it is a very odd thing. I'm not sure why we don't. And again, maybe part of it is because we like to think that we're above disease at this point. And it's silent. That's the other thing about viruses. Viruses, bacteria, all the organisms that cause disease, they're things we can't see. And sometimes things aren't tangible and we can't see them. And in addition to this, people repress their history and things that devastated them. So they don't want to talk about it. It was a very awful time, the people who had survived. I mean, we don't have many people who survived this disease now. But the people that they've talked to and interviewed, even in the past, have said that they just don't want to talk about that time. I mean, it's kind of repressed in their history in some ways.
It's fascinating. I just shared I'm going to be sharing a few links in the thread here as Kim shares things that I think that we should go back to. I just shared some information on the course for those of you that are watching that are UGA students that she just mentioned. I also just found the syllabus for it, so I'll share that in a second for those of you that want to go dig up some required readings. So I'm just flashing these here for those of you that need to access that. Tom Hodgson dogpiled on me with Alex Sams about how I'm a nerd. I think this is turning into cyberbullying, and so I'm going to tilt away from it. But Kim, we're barely taught about World War I. I mean, World War II for us is the Great War, whereas around the world, in many places, World War I takes on that notion. Here in Athens, for example, it wasn't until last year that I realized our own local history with the poppy, that international symbol of World War I. But yeah, you're right. It does seem that this sense of it being dirty is something that we don't like talking about. It's also something that's hard because you don't have agency with. You can imagine signing up to fight for war, but fighting a disease is hard, and that's something that brings us to today because we are in the midst of once again trying to decide this. I'll toss this question out at you as we're bridging the past and present. I keep hearing people say these are times we're going to tell our kids about. These are the times, or oh, we'll always remember this. One of my favorite jokes is that all of us now, as we get older, to the next generation that's coming, we'll really tell them to value toilet paper. You don't know what it's like to be able to go in the store and buy toilet paper. But given the way we've handled things in the past, should we feel any certainty that once we do get on the other side of this, that we're going to remember this moment? What does being an immunologist tell you on that subject? Are we going to have a short memory on this, a long memory on this? What do you think?
I think it depends on how close we are to another pandemic. I think, being 100 years out, that time is huge.
Right.
And I can even say that when this kind of popped up, I know you might not want to transition right away now into to SARS-CoV-2, but sure. When we talk about this, even I, when it was first kind of on my radar, just thought, okay, this is just something we're going to be okay with. It's not going to be, as awful as we're predicting. We're going to be under control. We're going to put in the preventive public health measures. It's not going to be as bad as flu.
Right.
And I was wrong then. You're wrong now if you still think that's the case. But that's part of science. Right. Part of science is that we look at data, we analyze the data that we're getting, and we can say we're wrong. Right. And I think a lot of people were particularly caught off guard with this one. I think that we just didn't realize how contagious this virus was. And I think it's again, that distance in memory, right? So the further we get away from that, and if something doesn't come until much, much later, we may forget about it again. We just don't know.
We're all learning new terms this year that many of us have never heard before. Social distancing, sheltering in place, contact tracing is one that the rest of the world seems to have learned that we really are still struggling to really grasp or implement. But even something as simple as the difference between an epidemiologist and an immunologist, that's still something that I think a lot of us are trying to learn. Can you help us draw that distinction a little bit more? What is an epidemiologist? What is an immunologist? What roles are they playing right now?
Yeah, so great question. So the immunologists are more studying how your immune system is responding to the virus. And it's a really important thing that's happening with this virus in particular. Normally you're infected with a bacteria, a virus, a parasite even. And your immune system has some inherent mechanisms in place to protect you from that organism. And immunology is also the basis of vaccines, right? So when we give a vaccine, what we do is we're trying to train your immune system to that organism so that if you see it again, you can respond quickly, you can eliminate it, and hopefully not have any kind of disease symptoms associated with that. So that's what we're trying to do. We're trying to understand at the very basic level the biology of what those organisms are doing, how our immune system is responding, and then how we can intervene to make those things better. And now there's a little bit of a different story with this particular virus. So this particular virus actually is causing a increased response of your immune system. So normally your immune system is very protective. So when you know, again, as I mentioned, when you get a virus, for example, normally you try to contain it. You have all these inherent measures that are really important. But with this one, your body is having it, at least the most severe patients, your body is having a difficulty in controlling it. So what it's doing, instead of firing like it normally would, it's firing times 100. So when that happens, sometimes your immune system can actually cause the damage. And that's what we think is with this virus. So this virus is actually causing your immune system to respond too much. And that's causing a lot of the pathology and a lot of the illness that we're seeing. So it's a little bit different than your normal response. And part of that is because we are considered a naive population. We've never seen this virus, at least in this shape and form. There are other coronaviruses that are causing our immune system to do this. So we're kind of at the basic level trying to understand, you know, in either animal models and cell culture, or with patients trying to understand what's happening. But then at the epidemiology side, they're more doing the disease tracing, the contact tracing. So they're watching how the disease is moving throughout a community. They're watching the public health, what measures we're taking and how that's controlling disease. And epidemiologists are not actually even linked 100% per se to the human population. So my students and I were actually talking about this today. So animals can actually tell us a lot about disease and how disease is spreading. So for example, in birds, so we learn a lot about birds and what's happening through sampling of bird samples for things like influenza, right? So we know that there are various strains of influenza that are persisting and birds are harboring all the time. And we can kind of watch that in that side of the field training. So there's a lot of, and this is, again, where this virus in particular comes into play, is that it was a zoonotic virus. So it was something that was in the animal population that kind of jumped into humans. And that's where we always have, you know, the worst time in terms of dealing with these things. So when we talk about the bird influenza, right? So that's something that, again, that's jumping from species into humans. So again, there's some epidemiology that's happening in the human side in the community and tracing the disease. But there are also people who are studying things in birds and other animals that also bats, right? So we think this came from a bat, just like we think Ebola comes from a bat. So there are other people who are also studying these things in animals as well, which is equally as important.
We've talked about fear and disgust. Fear and disgust definitely play into this in the sense that everyone I know has friends who have been taken in by the internet on this one. You know, and the internet is a powerful tool. There was not an internet in 1918, right? And so we do hear things like, oh, well, it didn't really come from a bat. It was created in a lab and weaponized. Or, oh, well, you know, we're sheltering in place. We're causing harm to ourselves. We actually need to be exposing ourselves to more microorganisms, and otherwise we're never going to get to herd immunity, and we're actually going to be more susceptible to future disease. Can you don't even have to include the ones I mentioned, but can you touch on some of the misconceptions that you've heard out there that our viewers should be very careful about spreading or believing?
So I particularly want to kind of latch onto the herd immunity thing, because the herd immunity thing works really well in the context of vaccines. So when we have something that we can generate an immune response in and make people immune to the organism, that makes herd immunity much easier, right? Because we know we are pointedly and very directly making a population immune. And for a lot of these organisms, I'm going to kind of move around a little bit, maybe too much, but for measles, so measles is very contagious. And in order for us to protect a population, we have to vaccinate about 90% of the population to really have herd immunity. Okay, so that's a lot of the population. We have to make sure that everyone is vaccinated. So letting herd immunity happen on its own, it's a lot of risk, right? So you could say, well, sure, we can open up the country and we can let people have herd immunity, but that means we have to risk the population to get that 90% coverage. And with a virus that we see is killing a lot of people who have pre-existing conditions, that's taking a lot of loss at the same time, right? And one of the key things with the shelter in place is that I think is so incredibly important, and I think maybe was not communicated 100% well, is viruses cannot exist on their own. So this virus and a lot of viruses need parts of our cells to replicate themselves. So they cannot, they die without us, right? So the part of sheltering in place is we take us out of the equation. So we say, okay, we're all going to hide away. The virus now has nowhere to go. So the virus dies off. And if we don't do that properly and we go out there, it's just risk, right? So it becomes risk. And I think when we don't have a vaccine, the risk is too high.
Mm. You know, the deaths, really quick here, I'm just going to say, so I see Jeremy said, I feel like I'm back in school. Love it. We're glad that you're back in school, Jeremy. We knew you could do it. Alex Sam said, thank you for saying you're wrong about the original idea of the virus. It makes you real and helps us trust you. Alex, we're going to go back in a second to the pressure to get it right in the beginning and some of the concepts that might have been communicated better before this shows up. And then Shannon Hinson's here saying, so glad you're explaining herd immunity. Absolutely. So Kim, as long as we're explaining concepts here, so thanks for explaining herd immunity. I want to talk about flattening the curve here for a second. So initially we were told we needed a shelter in place to flatten the curve. Mm-hmm. Many of us are still sheltering in place. Mm-hmm. And with the outlook on the vaccine, and even if we had one today, the production schedule to get one out, can you talk about the importance of flattening the curve, whether we got it right, and how long sheltering in place might be necessary for our communities?
Yeah, I mean, I think you've kind of touched on this a little bit. I think, when we talk about a vaccine, it's not this year. It's probably not the summer. Maybe it's the summer. But I would say it might be a year from now. So what does that mean? Again, it comes back to the risk, right? So my family is sheltering in place, again, because we don't want to take that risk. And I think I lost part of your beginning of your question.
Just the idea of, so I saw a tweet the other day where someone said, I thought we were sheltering in place to flatten the curve, not wait for the cure. Why are we still doing this?
Right.
Yeah.
So the flattening the curve a lot was because of the pressure that we had on the healthcare system. So we know, and it's really important to us in particular, in Athens, because we're a regional hospital. And from what I understand, most of the patients that we actually had in places like Athens Regional were actually not Athens residents. They were mostly people from the surrounding counties. So, to take that pressure off the healthcare system was really important. But I don't know if you've seen any of the data that we've been seeing in the last few days, looking at the United States versus Europe, for example. Europe has really, they went up on that curve and they've kind of come down, where we've gone up and we've kind of stayed at this plateau. We're not going down. So we have kind of, I would say, a smoldering infection. So we have infection that's still persistent in the community, that we have not gone down to those lower levels. So we haven't even gotten through that first wave yet. And what that means in terms of flattening the curve, if you will, is that we haven't gotten rid of those seeds in the community that can just ignite right away. So those embers are still burning, if you will. So we've done a good job, but by not bringing those levels back down to the bottom and keeping them burning, we're setting ourselves up for something that could potentially not be good.
Yeah, I want to just take a moment and thanks. I see Rob Taylor saying, thanks for sharing this info with your hometown friends in Delaware. Dan Delamater saying, this is another fantastic discussion. Thank you, Tommy and Kim. Kim, I want to flash something on screen here real quick. Let me share my screen. 1 second here. I'm going to actually do it this way, because what you're talking about here with the curve by country. So, because this is something I've been meaning to ask you about. 1 second. Okay, so I'm going to bring this into the stream here, and I'm going to pull myself off. So, okay, so, and Kim, I'm going to actually make this solo here. Okay, so
But
we can.
I may have to lift my glasses.
Yeah, that's okay. We can still hear you, and I'm going to zoom in a bit here. But one second. So this is the curve by country, and this is Johns Hopkins University shared this. I've been seeing it go around Twitter, and you can see where the curves have been by country, and you can see that orange curve there is the U.S. And it really brought home for me how outside the norm we were. When you recommended the 1918 flu book earlier, it indicated on the book flap information on Avid's website that 40 million people died in the 1918 flu. If that were to happen today, with today's numbers, that would be 1.5 million people dead in the US, which suggested to me that we received 1/40th of the 1918 flu. Well, we're certainly receiving far more than that percentage of coronavirus. And as you were saying, when you were talking about it kind of simmering, one can see in this chart where Brazil and the US, it may not be as bad as it was at its peak, but we are just kind of fluctuating around this point of 20,000 cases to 21,000 cases. Can you help us get a better understanding of what's happening here and what happened to get us to this point?
Yeah, and I think the easiest way for me to do that is kind of to transition into my experience when this kind of hit the fan. So, so we were actually traveling for spring break. So we had left in early March to go to the Seychelles, which is an island nation off the east coast of Africa. And we arrived there from the U.S. We had brought some protective measures. We weren't entirely sure what was happening, but we showed up into this very small island nation. And on arrival at the airport, our temperatures were checked. We were also given health information that we had to fill out. And they were really on top of it. When we came back, so we had our vacation, we were kind of watching what was happening. We came back into the United States the weekend where basically the US shut down. So only American citizens could come back into the United States. So we came back that following Monday. And we had to stay overnight in France. And when we arrived in France, France was a ghost town. Their cafes were closed. Their grocery stores were closed. Even the hotel we stayed at had, they already had the social distancing in place in terms of getting our keys. There was no room service. Everything in the public spaces was kind of had that kind of police tape. It wasn't police tape, but you know what I mean? It was kind of roped off. So there was no interaction with people. Europe had taken this incredibly seriously. And we know from places like Italy, for example, where they had completely locked down. Fast forward to the next day, we arrived in the United States, and we were in line at customs where everybody was, back to back. We got on a shuttle from the airport where they, instead of saying, okay, we're only going to take 2 or 3 people at a time, they were like, okay, let's fill up the shuttle. Let's get everybody, close together. So it was very interesting to kind of see the dichotomy between how Europe was responding. And yes, they kind of caught on to this and they had the virus spreading earlier than us, but they still were much more on top of shutting things down, whereas we were a little bit more of a slow trickle here in the United States. And then when we finally, did lock down, it wasn't consistent. We didn't have the consistency that a lot of the European countries had in terms of their lockdown. So, and even in the state of Georgia, we had a very different way of approaching this virus in Athens versus the rest of the state. So I think part of that is a lot of these countries in Europe took this incredibly seriously. Seriously.
So I want to just catch up again with our audience here. So Kelly says, I'm a tech guru. That's the nice nerd compliment. I'll take that. I shared the link for the Johns Hopkins things I just shared. Jeremy indicated that graph would be interesting if it was by continent, not country. I feel like all states can be separated out as we've had different infections responses, et cetera. Jeremy, I just shared the state-by-state version of that from Johns Hopkins, so you can access that. Kim, I have lots of friends that are devil's advocates. I could see someone saying, well, yes, our number is maintaining that 20,000 figure, but that's because of how many more tests are out there and how much more testing we're doing. That's why that number is staying consistent. Do you buy that? Are we looking at the data wrong?
Well, I think part of it is a lot of us are still sheltering in place. I don't think, I think a lot of the states, I can see this in Athens. I can see it in a lot of my friends and families. We're all still staying at home. We haven't kind of, released the doors.
Right.
So I think a lot of people, even given the opportunity to go out and about and do their business, are really kind of hunkering down. I mean, we have one person in our family still. I have not been in proximity to my parents who live in Athens since I got back. So I think a lot of us are still kind of holding back and not really getting out there. So I think, that's part of it. I think a lot of people aren't just kind of flipping that switch and going back to normal. I think if that were to happen and we would get out there, then we would certainly see things differently. Yeah. I think the other thing that Athens has is a very unique community, and being a college town, is we don't have the students who are coming back from Metro Atlanta and other places that are going to be maybe bringing this in, because we know that a lot of younger people are asymptomatic. So they're coming in and they're not, they're bringing in the virus without necessarily themselves showing any outward signs of having it. And of course, that's going to affect people who are susceptible to this disease. So I think it's going to be interesting to see what happens once we get started. Now, UGA has a lot of mechanisms in place. They're trying to really still limit some of that contact that we had in normal semesters. Yeah. So we'll see how that holds up. It'll be interesting to watch those numbers over time.
Georgia made headlines around the world when we reopened, and doing so at a time that was early enough that even our Republican governor was criticized by our Republican president for maybe jumping the gun a bit. Despite the concern and the suggestions that there was going to be mass carnage as a result of reopening, we haven't seen the numbers uptick the way we expected. It seems like what we're hearing from the scientific community, and this is consistent with what I think you just said, is that we haven't seen that uptick because even though we all are seeing outliers sometimes, a restaurant full of people, mm-hmm. Some people out not social distancing, you're suggesting those are outliers, that the majority of the Georgia population is still sheltering in place, and that's why we're not seeing the numbers uptick. Is that right?
I think it's a lot of it. I was watching something the other day on Squawk Box on CNBC, and they were talking about the economy in some of the states. So if you look at the retail business and the normal numbers, it's way down, right? So people clearly are not out shopping. They're not, doing some of the normal things that we would be doing. I mean, look, I work in a building with people who study infectious diseases, and we were not back until this week. And even now, we're not going back. We wear masks in our building. There's a lot of, I sense from my colleagues, I sense from a lot of people that I'm talking to that most people are still sheltering in place.
Yeah. One of the most important things, even tangentially related to your field, that I learned during my MPA studies was about the Lancet study situation with vaccines, that most of the information that has formed a steady underbelly on the internet against vaccine use was based on a study that was not only incorrect, but falsified to the point where the researcher that created it withdrew it, apologized for it, even though now that they have internet celebrity, they seem to have gone back the other way. We've seen the way the internet can create these hostile, conspiracy-based communities, these cults of personality against science. Mm-hmm. You're a scientist, but at the end of the day, you have emotions too. What is your emotional response when you see things like the Plandemic documentary that went all across Facebook, or these conspiracy theories that Bill Gates is planning to use this to track us all, or, I mean, do you have an emotional response when you see things like that spread?
I do, and I have to say, during this pandemic, I've been a little probably more silent than I should be, because I feel like there are certain, and I think we can say this about things even outside of science. You can start talking to somebody, and if they have their mind set, you're not going to change their mind, no matter how many facts, no matter how many things you can throw at them. And there's also this kind of issue of the death of expertise, right? So I always say, you can consult all these things online that you want, but there are certain people who are trained, who understand this. They know how to look at data. The example I love to give is, I don't ask my mechanic how to cut my hair. Right. So there are just this kind of idea of expertise, I think, is out the window. And part of that is explained by the internet. Right. So we have this kind of thing. My partner, Dean, he's a practicing allergist. He sees the same thing in his practice. People come in and they think they understand their disease because they've done things. And it's so much energy to kind of take people back to why they shouldn't be thinking that way. I mean, honestly, it becomes exhausting. That's right. Part of it too, is that, you have to spend a lot of time bringing people back. But part of that, again, is to blame on communication. I think we have to be better communicators as scientists. I think we have to be engaging the public, and we are not applauded for that. So, for example, I don't know if this is a bad thing to say, but at the University of Georgia, we have part of our commitment, and what we need to do as professors is all based on teaching and research. Very few of us have a service component, right? So the service component would be something that I would think would be very important in getting us out into the community and talking to people about science. I have kids who come into my lab, and that is the most exciting time for me, is to have kids in the lab, because that's when you get to really talk to them about science and get them thinking about how to be critical thinkers, all of those things that we appreciate just from that kind of scientific theory. And we don't do that enough as scientists. And there's a push. There are some people who are really trying to do that, but I think just in general, we're not doing a great job, and we can do so much better. We just need the encouragement. We need the support. And it's hard, again, when you're battling the internet. The internet, in some ways, it makes us smarter, but also makes us dumber in some ways, as I like to think. It's a battle.
So, I'm terrified to look at the clock right now and think about how many different things I want to touch on with you with the time that we have. But let me just kind of scout ahead for our viewers what they should expect. So Dan Delamater just asked a really interesting question that I want to throw to Kim on. We are going to then thank our annual sponsors. I'd like to delve into two last areas before we get to our closing questions. One is I'd like to just quickly go through something that we've alluded to a lot in this conversation, but not really directly dove into, which is communication mistakes or missed opportunities in the early days of the coronavirus. And then also, Kim, just like general recommendations for folks that are still out there trying to decide what they should do or believe right now. So let's kind of do those things in that order. We'll run through first with Dan's question. Dan said, if Kim was named Supreme Leader of UGA, I like that title, Dan, would she declare a mandatory mask policy for students and professors on campus? I'm interested as a visiting speaker to business classes and as a father of 2 UGA students and as a concerned Athenian. And Dan, I want to say thank you for your question. Dan and Corey were the sponsors for the first week of this program. They were the first sponsors to sign on, and we really appreciate Dan's support and questions. Kim, to Dan's question, if you were Supreme Leader Klonowski, would you have a mandatory mask policy?
I would at least until we get through the second wave and we understand a little bit more. We still don't know a lot, but we do know that masks can protect. We have been told by the university that we cannot require masks, although we can strongly encourage them. And the university is providing, I believe, 2 masks for every faculty, staff, and student on campus. Yeah. So they are doing so, but we cannot require them. And I gave this as an example, is my floor studies infectious diseases. We wanted it to be a mandatory policy. We wanted it to be mandatory, but we were told that we could not. And that's because we understand infectious diseases. And I I kind of, again, don't want to seem like this kind of academic on high, but I feel like if you have a bunch of people who study infectious diseases who want you to wear masks, I kind of just don't understand why you wouldn't maybe think about that. But we can't make people do it. Now, we are still very limited in the lab spaces, so we can only have so many people in there at a time. And you know, again, because we study infectious diseases, most of the people who work with us are graduate students, our staff. They understand and appreciate how diseases spread, and they're more than happy to do that. But if it were up to me, I would certainly make it mandatory.
Thank you. And yeah, I see Shannon chiming in to say that as a staff member at UGA, this is something I also think about. Kim, you mentioned the phrase second wave, so I'm going to break my order by just to throw a second wave question out there. The last week, we've seen the vice president come out and say that there is no second wave. We've seen some discussion of maybe that big bump we experienced was the second wave, and there was a small, minor first wave. You know, we've seen all this talk about second wave. For Athens, for the people watching this in Athens, it seems like if there's a fall second wave, that's going to coincide with all of these students coming back. What should we set our expectations to for the next several months? What's coming for us?
I don't know. It's one of those things where you just can't predict it, right? So even if you put, and the other thing is, if you put in places all the practices that are going to prevent it, then you don't know what would have happened, right? Had not. So that it becomes kind of that looking back kind of thing. I don't know. And I think that's, again, maybe that's the scientist in me, is that I can't predict what's going to happen. It'll be interesting to see what does happen. You know, if we talk about the history of the great influenza, that was when most of the death and devastation was. It was in the second wave. You know, people became complacent, you know, and just went out. And I think, again, that kind of feeds back to the viruses being invisible. We don't see them. And maybe if we're healthy and we're okay, it doesn't do anything to us. And that's what we're seeing. Most people who are healthy and can fight this, they're fine. It becomes an issue, again, if you're engaging with your parents or grandparents or people who have underlying health conditions like diabetes or heart disease, all those other things.
Right.
You know, you can just be tracking that in. And I know that I personally would not want to be responsible for, you know, through the contact tracing, being the one that they figured out gave it to someone who did, you know, succumb to this disease. I think that's a terrible burden that I think anyone would want to bear.
Kelly Bivens just shared, can professors encourage mask wearing by giving participation points? Grades get students motivated. Dan chimed in with something really great, which is wearing a mask is not required, but participation is 50% of your grade. My first thought went to office hours, trying to negotiate this whole thing. As an educator and immunologist, have you started thinking ahead of, you know, what's your pep talk to your class right now to wear your mask? You can encourage but not require. So what is that going to sound like?
Yeah. So I'm lucky, or maybe not lucky, that most of my teaching is spring loaded. So I actually was the one who got stuck with transitioning online and all those things when I came back on spring break. So I actually don't have any teaching in the fall, but I can tell you that they are encouraging still a lot of the classes to be online. So I think they're trying to have about 10% of the contact be in person. I know that some of my colleagues are kind of thinking about like breakouts and having like a third of the class come in on this day, a third of the class come in this day, and being very creative in how they're going to do that. But I think we're still going to have a lot of things online. So I think, again, when we talk about maybe there's not a second wave, I mean, who knows how much of that online content is going to contribute to the fact that we don't have a second wave. So it's one of those things where we just don't know what's going to happen and what we did to prevent it.
Kim, last question before I throw to annual sponsors and our closing questions. One thing I've been really obsessed about when it comes to the 1918 flu was, as they were approaching the fall of 1918, there was this ebb and then this additional wave hit. And one historic event that coincided with that was what I've heard referred to as the Liberty Loan Parade. It was the Philadelphia Parade. People thought it was okay to go back out. They held this big parade to celebrate a war effort. And as a result, a couple weeks later, so many people got infected that I think in Philadelphia, 750 people died in one day or something like that. it's hard for me when I hear about that not to think of college football or not to think of large public events in the fall as we gain this sense of, well, we survived that. We know the worst has already happened. Is that a reasonable fear? Am I being paranoid? What are we looking for here?
I don't think you're being paranoid. I think when you hear people like Dr. Fauci talk about, not wanting to be in areas where there's large congregations of people, thousands of people, and especially in an indoor, area.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know if you've seen some of the pictures that I saw come up from the AJC, the historical pictures that were showing some people at, I think it was baseball games, who had the masks on. Yeah. So, certainly continuing the mask effort would probably help in those outdoor situations. I know I've seen, again, I feel bad that I keep referencing Squawk Box, and I don't know why, because it's not my favorite show, but they were talking about some of the people who are retrofitting some of the stadiums in terms of making kind of box seating and also doing some plexiglass things. So I know with some of the professional sports that they're trying to implement some of those measures, which I think are important. I haven't heard anything about UGA in terms of what they're doing in terms of seating people in that stadium with 90,000 plus people, which is, in my opinion, a huge concern, because people are so excited about game day. They're so excited about football. Maybe if they have a sniffle, they're still going to show up, at a football game because they're so excited to go. So, I don't know. I mean, taking temperatures, maybe that's a way to go. I don't know.
I just flashed on screen the photo that you were referencing. This is fans at a Georgia Tech football game during the 1918 pandemic wearing masks, and many, it appears, keeping a distance, or maybe just the football team wasn't that good and nobody was out there. So I see Rob saying thanks again for great info, Kim, and Tom, thanks for tuning in, Rob. So, all right, Kim, give me one moment to thank our annual sponsors, and then we'll look at some final questions here. First of all, I just want to say that Kim's discussion today is one of 55. Tomorrow, we're talking to one of the students from ULead, a really incredible local organization. We're speaking to Linda Davis on Friday. And then we have some other conversations that round out the week next week, including a few makeup episodes that we're going to be announcing. So if you see any past names, whether it's Reverend Hart or Mayor Gertz or Chris from Creature Comforts. If there's anyone who you want to go back and see, go to the videos section of our Facebook page. You'll see the archive there. If you want a quick and easy way to support Historic Athens, you can go to historicathens.com and pick up one of our 3 new Historic Athens t-shirts. Our Buildings of Athens is already funded. We still need some additional shirts to sell in the Rock Springs Historic District and Boulevard Historic District to get those into production. When this episode is over, you can head over to the Welcome Center page, where our Welcome Center staff at 2:00 each day is doing a historic live cast that focuses on Athens. And so we encourage you to check that out. And then these names here are really important. We already thanked David and Linda and everyone with the Athens Downtown Development Authority for making today possible. But the sponsors you see here make our programming possible throughout the year at different sponsorship levels. We're so grateful to everyone you see here. We hope that you'll support these businesses and individuals. If you'd like to become a sponsor or a member, membership begins at only $5 a month. You can visit historicathens.com for more information. We ring a bell in the office every time we get a new member. Every member is important to us, and we try to express our gratitude in that way. Please support our 52-year-old mission as a 501c3 nonprofit and make a tax-deductible donation today at historicathens.com. So thank you very much. All right, so Kim, I've got you alone on the screen here. Let me join you. All right, so let's close out here. Last question before the closing questions, which we can go through in speed mode. But I feel like if we don't touch on missed opportunities, it'll be a mistake. So what are some things that what are some communication efforts that could have been undertaken in the early days of coronavirus that could have improved our current standing?
I think just talking about disease transmission, talking about how quickly this can spread, maybe, starting out from using very simple infographics. So I'm one of these people where I like something very simple, broken down, talking about how one person can spread it to these many people, to this many people, and kind of how that can seed a community. And talking about just how a little interaction or engagement can affect somebody down the road. So you might be hanging out with your friend who's also young, like you maybe are as a college student, but that person maybe goes home to grandma and passes this on. So I think thinking about this is not just about you. I think is a big important thing to understand, is that, you can, how easily diseases are transmitted. We forget about it again because it's the invisible thing. It's the thing we can't see, so we don't know.
Yeah.
I know that you've probably seen some of those things where they put things on your hands and they have you touch things and then they trace back where you were, to kind of really appreciate how much contact and how much transmission we can have very, very easily. So I think thinking about that, thinking about, pushing the idea of wearing masks, I think is super important. I think we've learned a lot about telecommunication and working from home. So if you don't have to go into the office, don't, we're doing it at UGA. If you're not, at the lab bench doing an experiment and you're reading, you're at home doing that, so kind of breaking those chains of transmission, I think, is really important.
Yeah. Alex Sam says Kim is a delightful scientist. Thanks for having her on. Thank you, Alex.
Thank you, Alex.
Ginger Redwine said good lesson. Thumbs up. Thank you, Ginger. So Kim, let's go into our closing questions here. Although I feel like I could spend another 4 hours with you and learn more. The first of the last three questions is the lightest one of the day. If you were to wake up tomorrow, this was all over, shelter in place wasn't necessary anymore, all of your favorite Athens businesses were not only offering curbside, but you could go in and have a drink or eat some food. How would you spend your day? Where would you go?
Yeah, so I think, so I live in the Bloomfield Historic District, and my house has the incredible benefit of being in front of a park. So we have this lovely park that a lot of people in the neighborhood go to, and a lot of our neighbors who have younger children go to, and we like to spend time out socially interacting and engaging with those kids. And that has been one of the hardest things. So, these are kids that we walk to school in the morning, that we, have that contact with. So I would love to see Nelson and Lori and Alexia in the park and kind of hang out with them and just play and be able to hug them. I think that's been hard. It's been hard to watch kids try to understand what's happening right now. So I would do that. I would spend time out with them and their family and their parents and maybe have a glass of wine. And then I'd head over to Sea Bear. I am dying for some oysters. I've been seeing some people who've getting oysters mailed to them and different things. And I'm like, oh my gosh, I'm salivating. I mean, the idea of having some oysters is, for me right now, is it's pretty big on the list. I've done a lot of takeout. So I feel like I've supported a lot of Athens restaurants, but the oysters are right now.
Yeah, Sea Bear for sure. Especially Sea Bear happy hour would be high on the list. Yeah. As we hopefully, sooner rather than later, find ourselves out of this pandemic, we'll likely also be emerging from a recession. And after a recession, traditionally, there's a lot of pent-up development pressure. Since part of what Historic Athens does is historic preservation, we've been trying to take time with each guest to ask them, what are historic places that we want to protect from that kind of thing? What are places, if somebody, Kim, is watching this interview at the UGA library 50 years from now and they walk outside, what are some of your favorite historic places that you hope that we've continued to preserve in this community?
So I think I'll start with one that's kind of obvious, and then maybe ones that maybe aren't as obvious. So the Morton is one of my favorite places. I think we underutilize the Morton as a community. I think we could do a lot more of community-friendly events there and really embrace that space. There's so much history there. There's it just is a gem in our community. So I really appreciate and love the Morton Theater. In terms of development, some of the places that I'm worried about are out on North Avenue. Worried about some of those spaces, again, being close to some of the Greenway and different things. I'm worried about that part of town. The other places that I would say that I'm worried about is kind of closer to my home, which would be like the Glenwood and the Beechwood neighborhoods. There's some beautiful mid-century modern homes over there, very very subtle, very, smaller homes on beautiful parcels of land. And I'm just worried about some of those homes and those neighborhoods kind of being built up. I don't want to say McMansion. I hate that phrase in some ways, but I feel like there's some possibility for those smaller, more modest homes to be torn down to accommodate some people's needs to be bigger and better.
Thank you. Yeah, I'm glad you highlighted that, because a lot of times we get the landmarks and monuments, and this idea of the most recognizable places in Athens, and yeah, the sense of scale and the charming architecture you're describing is worth keeping too. So thanks. The last question is just a completely open-ended one, but flashing forward another 50 years past that student we were imagining, if somebody's watching this 100 years from now, and they want to know what life in Athens was like during COVID-19, what would you want them to know?
I feel like I'm echoing other guests because I have listened to a lot of broadcasts, but I think Athens was incredibly progressive and incredibly forward thinking in terms of saying, let's shut this down right now. Let's take a step back and let's see what's happening around us. I think, again, it's, this whole unknown and being scared of the unknown. We should always be scared of the unknown. And I personally think that the fact that they had the fortitude to do that, even when we had someone who lived maybe 19, 20 miles from the Centers for Disease Control, not feeling that same way, the fact that they took it on themselves to do that and really protect our community, I think was incredibly impressive. And it was a hard decision. I know that it was a hard decision. And I think that protecting our hospitals, protecting the rest of the community and the surrounding community, it was spot on. Couldn't have gotten any better.
Excellent. Kim, closing with some recommendations here. Alex says, simple infographics would be great. Please press for that idea. I'm in real estate. Keep it simple, stupid. So kiss. Kim, if somebody watched today's program and they're inspired to find out more, I know we've talked about some of the wrong-headed places to find your facts. But do you have any recommendations on where people should be tuning in, or what website or sources that you trust that we can find simple information?
Oh, that's actually a hard one. Actually, I'm not sure that I know the answer to that. The CDC always has great infographics. They do usually break things down pretty easily for people. I know that they are, of course, pulled into different places right now. So I'm not sure how up to date some of their things are. There's lots of great podcasts out there. Unfortunately, I tend to watch some that are a little down the weeds. So there's this one called This Week in Virology, which is a great one. But again, it might get a little too sciencey, but it does kind of hit on, they have some scientists and different guests who are on, who talk about what's happening this week in science. So that's a good one that I would recommend. But again, might be a little too down there. But I think just watching Dr. Fauci, I think people have really kind of elevated his presence, and it's for a good reason. This is a smart guy. He runs, a big institute at the National Institutes of Health. He has been around through many things that we've had to deal with. I think watching his cue is another thing, and his message, I think, is an important thing.
Excellent. Well, thank you for that advice. Kim, thank you for your time and for your help and the work that you do with us. And obviously, we wish everyone in your line of work a lot of luck right now. So thank you so much for your support, and thanks for being on the program today.
Yeah, thanks for having me. It was great. It was really fun.
Great. Well, thank you. Kim and I are going to go offline now, but thank you so much to everyone who tuned in. We'll be back tomorrow at 1 o'clock. We hope that you'll join us. Take care, be safe, stay healthy. Thanks. See you tomorrow.